recapture the missionary nature of the church, we begin to see that each and every person individually is a called and sent missionary person.
Well, welcome back to the Living Sent podcast. I am so glad that you are tuning in. On today's episode, we are talking about 3 paradigm shifts for your church. Today's episode is a special episode because it is the first interview we've had on this podcast, and I am pumped to have interviewed my friend Brad Brisco about our topic today. Before we get into the interview, I want to say a huge thank you to those who have been listening and sharing this podcast. If you haven't done so already, it would mean the world to me if you went to wherever you listen to this podcast and rated and reviewed this podcast. And I would also love to hear from you. Maybe after listening to today's interview, you have a question, or you'd like to send me your feedback, or you have a thought, or you've been reading some books or resources that go along with something we're talking about. I would welcome all of that. The way you would go about doing that is by visiting my website at justinwester.com and navigating to the Connect tab. The Connect tab. You can send me a message there, and who knows, maybe I'll even read some of those questions and answer some of those questions on future episodes. As always, I'll make today's show notes available for free at my website. Once there, just navigate to the podcast tab and you can download the show notes there as well as a transcript from today's interview. As I mentioned before, Brad Brisco is my guest today. And if you don't know Brad, you are missing out. He currently works at the North American Mission Board as the Director of Bivocational Church Planning. He holds a doctorate degree in missional ecclesiology. Yeah, listen to that, missional ecclesiology. And he is an author. He's written a number of books in the areas of missional living and church planting. And I will link to some of those books in the show notes if you're interested in hearing more from Brad. Brad has also graciously written the foreword to my upcoming book, Living Sent. This book is going to be all about discovering how these everyday habits that we've been talking about can actually make an eternal difference. And it's going to be available this fall, and I am so excited for it to be available to you and this podcast community. So be on the lookout for that. This interview you're about to hear took place while I was completing my Doctor of Ministry degree, and I'll tell you that the audio is not the best, but I have boosted the audio as much as I can. But if you're listening and you still miss something, again, I'm making the transcription available to you on my website. Just go there and you can find it there. Well, I am so pumped for you to hear what Brad has to say because it perfectly aligns with the purpose of this podcast, which is to equip you to live as a sent one of God within your household, within your neighborhood, marketplace, in your city. These ideas are huge ideas, and I hope you will take the time to listen to the whole thing, to really dig in, and to reflect on the 3 paradigm shifts for your church today. Here's the interview. What aspects of identity do you believe are central and foundational to the nature of the church?
Yeah, man, that's an easy for me. It has to do with the missionary nature of the church. I mean, I just think that lays the foundation for everything else. I mean, all the other paradigm shifts, all the other changes, all the different ways we need to think as a church in the West, I just think all of it flows from the missionary identity of the church. I think we've lost the missionary nature, the missionary ethic of the church.
Yeah. So how does that, in your opinion, begin to change things for people? I know now you're working at North American Mission Board. You're doing a lot of bivocational church planning and training people who are in the field.
It changes everything. It changes everything. So 2 overarching ways is, I think it's a paradigm shift both for the individual, but then also it's a paradigm shift for the collective body of Christ. Mm-hmm. So in other words, when we recapture the missionary nature of the church, we begin to see that each and every person individually is a called and sent missionary person. So the first thing has to do changes our identity in a sense, and it certainly changes the identity of the corporate body.
Yeah.
And so then the implications of that are just immense. I mean, it changes the way we think about our work. It changes the way we think about where we live. It changes the way we think of ministry. I think it changes the way we think of discipleship and evangelism. It changes the way we think of the structure of church, leadership. I mean, really, just about everything about missiology and ecclesiology, I think, is shaped or informed by that missionary identity.
Yeah, that's good. What about on the flip side? I mean, I think you've got a unique perspective there, training and coaching some of these, current and future church planners. Like, what sort of false beliefs about identity do you think are most destructive, or do you find most challenging where you're at right now?
Oh, that church is only a Sunday morning gathering, or church is a place where certain things happen, or the worst of all
Yeah.
is understanding the church is a vendor of religious goods and services. So we think that we are to provide religious goods and services for consumers to consume of. I think that's probably the most damaging. But yeah, it probably has to do with, for church planters, it probably has to do with being too Sunday-centric. And I'm not anti-gathering whatsoever. We are a gathered people. But probably being too Sunday-centric, and then probably being too guy-led. That there's one, key dude that's supposed to pull this whole thing off. I think that's also very harmful.
So how do you currently help train others to rethink what you just mentioned, or embrace and apply that missionary identity to themselves first and foremost, and then also to what they're trying to lead and what they're trying to do?
Well, first, in most cases, if I had the opportunity, it's just to spend some time talking about the paradigm shift and trying to just kind of challenge our traditional thinking on church and mission, So it's usually just trying to spend some time, like I said, just kind of introducing the idea that we may actually need to unlearn and relearn. And usually if we have time to really kind of lay that out and in a very, gracious way, 99% of the time people go, yeah, something's not quite right.
Right, yeah.
And there's different ways to go at it. Sometimes kind of go at it just to help people rethink the nature of the church, but sometimes you can go at it from kind of a cultural shift perspective, just to help people see that we live in a very different time and place than we did even in the 20th century. So it's funny, I'll say people kind of enter into this conversation in one of two directions. I call it either a crisis of influence or a crisis of mission. So what I mean by a crisis of influence is people, they kind of enter into this whole conversation because all what they know is what used to work doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
So, I hear all the time people say, yeah, we did this thing when we used to get 200 people to show up, and now 40 show up. And they're not sure why, and they certainly aren't sure what to do. They just wonder if this whole kind of missional conversation might have an answer. So that's they kind of enter into the conversation from a pragmatic, what used to work doesn't work anymore.
Right.
But then the other group of people, crisis of mission, and this is typically, it's a generalization, but it's typically a younger generation, but they enter into the conversation because they know something's not right. They just have kind of a check in their spirit that, sure, this can't be what it's all about. Meeting for an hour on Sunday morning, singing 3 songs, and hearing someone, give a lecture, that surely isn't what Jesus had in mind.
Right. Yeah.
So because of that, you can kind of go at the topic from different directions. Like, can be from a little more of a pragmatic, or you can be from a little more theological, theoretical.
Yeah. Well, as you're coaching and training, in your ministry context now, what are some of the things that you look for to try to measure if people are starting to rethink some of the things that you mentioned? Like, what are the things that you try to either hear or see, and you say, okay, now I understand. They're starting to pick up maybe just a tad bit of what I'm talking about.
Well, some of it's, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. One is just a bit of a holy discontent with status quo.
Mm-hmm.
So just people that they're just uncomfortable just doing the same thing over and over again. But much more important than that probably is to actually start to live differently. So they start to have stories about engaging with their neighbors or, seeing things they didn't see before. So it's I mean, the ultimate, the paradigm shift starts to take root in that behaviors and activities.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually start thinking and acting more like it.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to go ahead and shift into presence a little bit. I'm trying to keep you at 10 minutes per little word here. So presence, I'm referring to it and understanding it through a lens of how local churches relate to their immediate context. So every church is, obviously, this is kind of a duh statement, is situated in their culture. They have a unique perspective about their culture. Some have even developed practices on how to engage their culture, and some will even go as far as saying, oh, this is our mode of presence, or mode of engagement. This is we're a traditional church, we're an attractional church, or hybrid, organic, whatever they say. But what aspect of presence has been most paradigm shifting for discipleship in your ministry context?
Yeah, so a couple things I'd say. One, it's my initial thought, what you kind of unpack there, and then I want to get to answer your question. But I think the first thing that's helpful to recognize, because most people today, unfortunately, they don't live in their church context. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of kind of regional churches. People might drive 10 minutes, they might drive 30 minutes to the place where their church meets. Well, because of that, I think we actually have to do kind of context work in two places, where they live, and then also what's the context around where their church is. And so those can be two very, very different things. So I think that's important. But I think, for me personally, this is just my bias, but I think the number one topic or issue for people to struggle with, to reflect on, to really help them fully understand presence is incarnation.
Yeah.
So it's actually one of the, kind of key paradigm shifts for me. The first paradigm shift is the church, and what we talked about a few minutes ago. The second, and kind of the other side of the same coin, is incarnational presence, or sometimes I'll call it incarnation. But the bottom line of that for me is it's allowing the incarnation to form our posture towards the context. And unfortunately, in most evangelical tribes, we just don't think about the incarnation much. I mean, in fact, I say this all the time in my tribe, which is the Baptist tribe. When we talk about Christology, we almost always just talk about one thing, thought. Now, I'm not diminishing that. We should talk about that, obviously.
Yeah.
But we have to have a more comprehensive and robust Christology that includes the incarnation. Because the incarnation, I mean, what more should influence our posture towards our context? What more should influence our understanding of presence than the fact that God took on human flesh and stepped into the muck and mire of us? Then that ought to be, in a sense, almost a model or an example of how we ought to step into the muck and mire of our context. So I just think it's I just think it's where we have to start. When we talk about presence, before we can get to any kind of practical contextualization or how do we learn about our context, all that, we have to just be seriously influenced by the theological implications of French. Yeah. And I just don't think we just don't typically do that. We just hardly ever talk about the incarnation. And the incarnation is like the Christian story. And that's about it. But it's very significant.
Kind of similar to the identity questions, is there a false belief about presence that you find is just most prevalent and or most challenging to discipleship? I mean,
Well,
if
I just don't think we get it. I mean, I don't think we even think about it or reflect on it. So it's almost like not even on our radar. And
Gotcha.
part of it, I don't think we've allowed the incarnation of life and Jesus to truly inform our posture. And because of that, we distance ourselves from sinners. We distance ourselves from sin. Distance ourselves from, and I shouldn't say sin, but from sinners. I mean, we think we should keep, a distance from the world. And that's the reason we get away with that is because we haven't allowed the incarnation. We haven't really allowed the teaching and life of Jesus to influence our posture. I mean, we don't actually realize that Jesus brings us in. Jesus instructed us in flesh. Yes, Jesus. All of that, we get away with this. We should be separate from the world because we haven't allowed Jesus to influence us. Now, there's boundaries there and barriers. That we have to do all that with and if I do training on all that, I always say that. Like, look, you don't just fling your doors open to every and any great stuff that's out there. But it's crazy just how distant we are from the world. And again, that influenced in discipleship and evangelism. Because if we think we need to be separate and distant from the world, in our view of evangelism, it's some kind of unnatural, artificial, or spiritual law that we have to share with strangers because we don't have any friends that are lost. So yeah, I just think, man, that whole concept or topic of presence it's just enormous. I mean, really, those two things, and like I say, I like to think about them on two sides of the same coin. One side of the coin, the missionary nature of the church, and the other side of the coin is incarnational presence.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's go ahead and move into praxis. I see presence, just naturally leading into praxis, like in my mind. And so I want to ask questions about presence, but it's like, okay, I'm already in the praxis category here. But what do you think, and this is kind of a two-sided question, what do you think are some of the most powerful expressions of praxis for believers, number one, in your ministry context, and then number two, not yet believers? Like, if you could think through their mindset for a second, like what would they say, or what have they said, have been some of the most powerful expressions of the church being the church? Does that make sense?
That's a good question. I guess I would, initially I'd probably try to frame it, again, individually and collectively. For individually, it's just, it's having friends, really doing life with lots of people so they can see that we actually live different, that we live life of great sacrifice and, radical hospitality and generosity. But if we're not doing life with people, if we're not in close proximity, and we're not present with them, so they're not doing that. So I think individually, it has to do with those things, just kind of like our behaviors and the way we live, generosity and hospitality and all of that. And then I guess there would probably be things collectively too as a body. Hopefully there's things that a church collectively is doing for the sake of the city that people see. In any city, there's probably churches that are known for, what they do for the sake of the city. Unfortunately, it's not. There's not a lot.
Right.
There should be. It ought to just be. But we all see different stories, and if I had time to reflect, I'd probably think of a story just last week of, a church that has just, instead of building a building, they use the money for such and such, or, I can think of different, there's a church here in town that's been very involved in the last decade. They're real involved in this movement. They actually lead it. It's called What is the Church? And it's all about churches working together in so they have lots of different service days. They have, they just kind of team up, and it's across denominational lines. So I know there's people in the city that see that, and it's like, wow, so churches are not even the same denomination, but they're coming together, to work on certain things. I'll tell you, The other example, I think, is probably foster care. I mean, the church is starting to kind of step up to the plate on foster care. And I know there are some cities where the church big C is just going at trying to eliminate, every kid in the foster care that it can be or is looking to be adopted.
Yeah.
So, there's things like that kind of collectively that kind of gives a foretaste of the like that.
That's good. I'm just curious, are there things, from a praxis standpoint that maybe the church collectively needs to stop doing? In your opinion, and if so, what are some of those things to make way for some of these other expressions of the church being the church?
Well, I mean, practically speaking, I would say one of the things we need to stop doing is so much stuff for ourselves. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a silly answer, but I think of this has been years ago, but I taught in Spanish class at a small Mennonite brother in college for several years. And every year I taught this evangelist class. The very first session, the very first class, I would divide the whiteboard, and I would ask them to list every program and activity in their church that was for members of the church. And we would make like this super long list on the left side of the whiteboard. And then after we did that, and it would take a long time, I'd say, okay, now list every program and activity the church has for those outside the church. And every semester, there was always one or two people in the class that they could think of one. Sometimes they might say, oh, well, our Sunday school classes are small groups. Those are for people outside the church. And like, yeah, well, let's talk about that. And then eventually they'd come around to go, no, okay, not really.
Yeah.
So maybe, there may be some things. But otherwise, I don't know. Just, I guess it would just be things that, we probably need to have a longer term instead of just like a one shot, hey, let's do this and feel better about ourselves. We're going to do this outreach event on this Saturday, and then, next year we'll do it again. We probably ought to just have a long haul, kind of long runway of trying to bring about things, positive things.
Yeah. I feel like you've already answered this, but I just like asking the same question a couple different ways. But what are some of the indicators that you look for when people begin to rethink praxis and also act upon it? Like, are there things that you are looking for specifically that would say, okay, man, I think they're starting to rethink some things or unlearn and relearn, like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole slew of like scorecard issues, different things to count and measure. So, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of different things. I don't know that these are the things I would look for. I don't know that I do look for these, because in most cases, I work with planters or existing congregations that are trying to make shifts. I may not like walk along with them over a long period of time, but we do talk about scorecards. I think scorecards has been enormous. Because if we really want to make changes, then we need to start counting and measuring. So yeah, I mean, different indicators could be so I'll usually frame counting and measuring different. Even though we use those two words interchangeably, they're actually different. So counting is quantitative, and then measuring is qualitative. So counting would be, I would say we need to count missionary behaviors and activities. There's all kinds of different activities that I think we should actually start counting. So begin to say, oh, that's important, or what gets counted kind of gets repeated. So all kinds of missionary activities as it relates to, it could be just really, there's 100 different things, from something as simple as how many meals you share with people outside the church each week, to how many hours does the church collectively spend tutoring kids from school. How many people have we prayed for outside the church membership? There's just all kinds of different activities for people. And then measuring. Typically, what I'm talking about there are indicators in the city. It has to do with crime or education, poverty issues. Are there things that we can actually measure to see our involvement in the city as it makes a difference?
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
It does, yeah. That's good.
So yeah, I just think scorecards, measurements, metrics, have to be a part of this whole conversation. We have to start counting here.
That's great.
Because right now, typically all we do is we count how many people show up and how much money.
Yeah.
And, it sounds snarky, but that doesn't give us any indication whatsoever of the impact it's having on food. It doesn't, it just doesn't tell us anything. It just tells us how many people are showing up and how much money they get.
Yeah.
So we have to start counting the metrics.
Wow, a huge thanks to Brad and his time. Just a reminder, if you'd like to continue the conversation with a friend or maybe someone at your work or a few people at your church, you can download the show notes and the transcribed interview for free on my website at justinwester.com. Simply navigate to the podcast tab and they are yours. That's all the time we have for today. Remember, you don't have to live sent, you get to. See you next time.